Hi, my name's Tom Loker, and welcome to Health Reform 2.0. It's the only podcast in the world for people with a curious mind who'd like to have a better healthcare system. Today we're going to be talking about episode 1.3. It's Medicine Becomes an Industry. It's all about the patent medicine kings and their rule and how physicians sought safety in numbers. I'm joined today by my good friend and guest host, Tim Henning. So, Tim, how are you? And since you were in Cabo last time, where are you today?
Well, I made it back home, although I wish I was back in Cabo because I just spent 4 hours in a dentist chair having my front bridge removed, the root canal, and now I'm starting to be able to speak again. So it was a good thing because 3 hours ago, we wouldn't be doing this.
Well, I'm glad that you got through the chair, as they say.
That's true, but I can tell you this new technology, that root canal was done in 20 minutes. It was amazing. I mean, the technology of today it's been a long time since I had a root canal, thank God, but I was very impressed with the overall technology.
Well, it's interesting because when you look at dentistry, you do see that healthcare has actually progressed a lot, particularly in terms of pain management and the things they can do with reconstruction of jaws and mouth and teeth and dentures and all kinds of things. It's really come a long way. It's just the problem we have today is that we believe healthcare is a lot further on than it really is. Anyway, that kind of is an introduction. We're glad you're back from Cabo and glad you had a good time. So what are we going to talk about today?
So before we start, I wanted to ask a couple of questions, but today we're going to talk about the patent medicine trade, the people around it. We're going to talk a little bit about the AMA, why it was formed, how it was formed. And then it's going to lead us into our next chapter and next episode. So before we start, can I ask you something that's on my mind concerning history?
Sure, absolutely.
Well, I've been a fan of history since my senior year in high school. I don't know quite what started that, but I can remember when I was a senior in high school. It was 1969, and I had an appendectomy. And of course, back then they didn't have the laparoscope, so recovery was the surgery was the old-fashioned way, and the recovery was 5-8 days, depending. I was in pretty good shape, so I recovered pretty fast. So during the week I was at home recovering, my history teacher came to the house and went over the history lesson for each day. And I remember that like yesterday. So maybe that has some roots in why I've been so interested in history all this time. So I find history to be fascinating, and you're very aware of my passion for ancient history. And now the history of healthcare. And that is because I stumbled onto your book years ago when I walked into that bookstore in Blackhawk, which, by the way, is no longer there. And then, fortunately, we were introduced by an individual that was a mutual friend, and the rest is history. So the question I have for you is, what inspired you to write your book in the first place? Was it the passion of healthcare, history, or both?
It was kind of both in part, and then there was another big reason that not many people would suspect. I wrote the book because I was pissed off. When I was going to Washington before Obama got elected on health-related matters, healthcare-related matters, I was going to D.C. quite a bit, walking in the halls of Congress, talking to Congress people about how to provide better care to difficult-to-serve populations. Healthcare reform started going, but throughout the debate on healthcare, I started to get really angry. It was amazing because almost every page of every bill out of every committee I read in the course of the entire debate of Obamacare, including reading the final bill. Yeah, some people in Washington did really read the Affordable Care Act. I actually read every bit of the damn thing. And at first I was struck as it was coming to conclusion how incongruent the legislation was in reality. And I came to the realization they weren't trying to fix healthcare at all. I know that sounds odd, but they weren't. And the whole point of the Affordable Care Act was not to fix the healthcare system. Nancy Pelosi and Charlie Rangel and a number of others even said so on national television. They wanted to kill the existing system, and the Affordable Care Act was a step in the right direction to get them to have a single-payer system in the United States. And as we now know, they failed to get a single-payer system actually built into the bill because even Democrats couldn't agree to the idea of having one payer, the federal government, pay for everything. But when the bill passed, I was frustrated and I was angry. I couldn't believe they had passed this mess. It was clear to me at the time it was passed it wasn't going to work. And I started to wonder why we arrived at this place where we had all these myths and misconceptions about healthcare, how these things build up in our mind to us having really a fantasy belief of what healthcare can deliver to us on a daily basis. And the book was a result of my own journey of discovery. I found that we can't fix what we have until we really understand why it doesn't work. So that was how the book came about. It was an exercise of my own frustration.
Wow. You know what? I should be writing a lot of books because I'm frustrated, pissed off by a lot of things.
It's the best motivation on the planet, brother. Get pissed off about something, sit down and write it out so you don't go punch somebody.
Yeah, sounds like a pretty good therapy. I should try it.
Yeah.
So I want to cover something that we kind of talked about in between shows that had to do with history and some of the confliction that people have in their minds. I have a lot of people that don't appreciate history. They criticize some of the things that we talk about. And I'm not talking about healthcare. I'm talking in terms of just history in general. And I think that's, people have to have a better understanding of what history means to us and what we can learn from it. And it's very easy to sit there and say, well, I don't know how they didn't figure that out. I don't know why they didn't know this. And it's easy for us to look back and see these things today because we know the outcome. It's easy to say, what a bunch of idiots. But they didn't know any better at the time. And this we had this discussion around the patent medicines. Take a quote from Dan Carlin, who, by the way, in my mind, is the god of history podcasting. Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. If you haven't listened to it, I highly recommend it. Anyway, to quote him, history is elastic, and it's like looking at a billboard from either 2 feet away or 200 yards away. So I think that it's so easy to sit back and look and say, what we're facing today, we're making decisions in real time, right, wrong, or indifferent. And we're making decisions on the data we have at our hands or data we choose to look at, data we choose to ignore. One of the things that came up that it was troubling me is when the people being upset about this whole Oscar thing, which, by the way, I find ridiculous, but concerning the darkest hour, the story of Churchill. Yeah, Churchill had his problems. He was a racist. He was a chauvinist. He drank from the moment he got up till the moment he went to bed. We can go on about the Mr. Churchill and his bad things. And what we failed to do is realize, well, that's what it was in that period of time. That's what we were facing, and that's decisions he made. And he made some incredible contributions to the UK and to the people into World War II. But we get bunched up in all this stuff that we can look at in retrospect. And my point of view in all this stuff is, I got to put myself in their place. I have to sit down and look at exactly what happened within a different context. It's okay to criticize, I understand that. But I have to put myself in the shoes at the time to understand why they made these decisions and what they did.
Right. Well, if you look at Churchill, or you look at Clinton, or you look at Bush, either one, or you look at Reagan, or you look at Donald Trump today, some of our greatest leaders of all time have had flaws. And why we seem to think today that our leaders should have no flaws whatsoever, should become monks and live like priests and never have an interest in another woman, or never have an interest in having extra money, or never have an interest in anything else. We seem to forget that they're human and that humans make mistakes, number one. And number two, the things that drive us forward often have nothing to do with a foresight in the future. They have everything to do with trying to solve the problem of today.
Very true. And if you look at through all of history, to Julius Caesar, to Alexander the not so great, in my opinion, and others, all of them had major character flaws, and but they had a number of things in common. They got results one way or the other. There's another really bad guy that we talk about a lot. That's Stalin. And Stalin is, he was a brutal dictator. He's did some horrible things. But you can also make the argument he did what he had to do at the period of time to save Russia. And I have a quote from him that I found interesting, because I think it's the way you look at things in general from a point of view of a historical viewpoint, when you've got the data and you've got a long stream of information that you can look at. And his quote is this, quote, "One death is a tragedy. 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic." So when I look at those things, it's kind of an example of what we tend to look at in history. And it gives us a viewpoint sometimes of things that you would go back and look and say, I don't understand how they could have done any of these things. Well, you weren't there, and we need to learn from that. I'm afraid that our leaders, they don't study history. And if they do, they choose to ignore it. Perfect example is the Iraq War in the Middle East. If you understood the Middle East, you would have understood that was a really bad idea. It's very easy for us to criticize the past. Decisions were made because today we know what the outcome is, but they didn't. We were not in that moment or time. And I am sure that 100 years from now, others will look back on us and say, what a bunch of idiots. Your thoughts?
Well, you can look back at the last century, and we started to talk about this the last episode. In the late 1800s, it was a difficult time for many people. We spent a much larger portion of our time in those days focused on things like getting water, getting sustenance, disposing of our human waste, keeping our housing in good shape. People were worrying mostly about just basic survival. Fire, something that today we still contend with, but fire in those days was a major threat. So the day stopped shortly after sun went down. But the reality is most people shortly after the sun went down went to sleep. They didn't like having open flames around the house. It was dangerous. Fireplaces would spit at night and cause fires. Lamps would fall over. But people spent most of their time in that day and age just trying to stay alive and stay safe. Now, if you look back then at the patent medicine men or the doctors of the day or even the druggists of the day, they were just business people, and they were coming under fire. And it wasn't just them, it was the entirety of business. We were at the middle of the Industrial Revolution at the early 1800s, and old line businesses were starting to be replaced. But you had lots of changes going on. Druggists were replacing what was prior the apothecaries. You had hospitals and druggists and doctors competing with each other, and they were all hurting the business of private physicians. And even in the ranks of the private physicians, there were new schools of medicine, homeopathy, osteopathy, eclectic, and they were stealing large amounts of patients from private allopathic physicians. So they did what anyone would do in their day and age to survive and to protect their business and family. They came together to protect their way of life and fight to preserve their occupation. By the way, so did lawyers, so did the patent medicine men, so did the apothecarists, and these groups, with the backing of many of the robber barons that we talked a little bit in the last episode, they formed associations, or later we called them cartels, for one purpose, to protect their business interest and keep them alive. So it's easy to wonder now why they did what they did, but it was no conspiracy to go out and hurt people or to take money from people and screw them over. It was a strong desire to survive and become successful. They knew far less about the potential consequences because they hadn't done the things that created the consequences that we suffered yet. So they didn't know really any better, and to a great extent, we don't know any better about some of the things we're doing with the internet and other electronic devices than future generations are going to know as they pay prices for what we do. In healthcare, I would say we don't understand the true threat that wiping our hands with antibacterial soap and everything 5, 6, 7 times a day is going to have on succeeding generations' immune systems. But of course, today, looking back at the 1890s, it seems obvious of what's going on. That's why we say hindsight is 20/20, I suppose.
I believe that's true, and it falls back into the whole dialogue that we've had around the way we kind of viewed things in the past and what is even relevant to today. Did you happen to look at that deck I sent you this morning from the HIMSS conference in Las Vegas?
I did, a little bit, yep.
Yes, that's another example of the ever-changing, the evolution of creating new opportunities and new things. You could see the massive amount of vendors and equipment and the uncharted territory of IBM Watson and artificial intelligence and those type of things. So now we're embarking in a whole new area that will equally cause us more consolidation, more associations, and clarity in my mind about what it all means. But I digress a little bit, and I'll keep off that, but we'll talk about that in the future.
I want to bring up one point of that, and you and I are as guilty when we were in development of some medical devices and things in the past. We do them almost because we can. We always justify what we can do that they're going to help people. But sometimes we never really truly ask why we're doing it. Why are we building it other than to build a business and make money? Now, in our case, we've always looked beyond the why for today, and we've tried to figure out of doing something where we're doing well and doing good at the same time. But for a lot of people, they're building new devices because they have the idea, they have the ability, they want to make money. And we can blame them for wanting to make money, but it's human nature.
It is, and that's their corporations. That's what their task is to do. They have to make money for their shareholders. So that's a good recap, good segue to the recap from last episode 1.2. So in that episode, as we mentioned in your previous comments, we talked about the Patent Medicine Manufacturers in 1852. The American Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Dealers Association was formed. 1881, a group of these largest associations formed the Proprietary Associations of America, America's first drug cartels. And they were supported by the newspaper men and the robber barons of the time. Guess things haven't changed much. We're going to talk a little bit about that. You talked in your last episode about the total power of these groups. And what we could say, maybe they had blood money on their hands. I'm not so sure because, again, per our previous discussions, it probably was not a conspiracy. So you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, yeah, they spent a lot of time building their businesses and, again, trying to support their family, trying to build a business, trying to make money. Remember, these guys were in a new country. The 1880s, 1870s, 1830s, when a lot of these guys formed, the United States hadn't been the United States all that long, 50, 60, 70 years in some cases when these things started. So they're in the new frontier and they're trying to build their businesses. They're not sitting around trying to necessarily become the robber barons of America. That was something that they assumed as they gained inordinate success. You could look at Bill Gates as an example, or Warren Buffett today, and they are the same kind. And Jeff Bezos and the guys, the Google brothers, the Page brothers. These guys are these highly successful men like Rockefeller and company of their era. And we look at them, you look at Google, and Google's one of their first mottos was do no harm. And there are a lot of people today that will argue that Google is doing a lot of harm, that they're not quite the same altruistic organization they were in the past. So yeah, the drug cartels came along and they sold a lot of drugs and they got a lot of control over America, and they did a lot of bad things, but they also did some good things. And we look at it historically and can see all the evil that they did, but at the time they weren't seeing it as evil. They were seeing it as trying to build a thriving business. And mindsets were different. People had very different mindsets. Go back to the 1890s and look at the platform of the Republican and Democratic parties, and you will find what we consider Republican today was actually Democrats back then. We talk about the progressive era, and we equate that today to democratic liberalism. But the root of the progressive era started under Teddy Roosevelt.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, so what I'd like to do is just kind of extrapolate that before we get to the next episode's meat. Let's talk about today's TV ads. It seems to me every hour, on the hour, maybe every 45 minutes, I don't know. Every time I'm flipping through the channels, because I listen to radio more than TV, but I do watch some TV, is an ad for some new drug or something that they want you to take on continuously. And it's interesting because it's 5 minutes about the drug and at least 10 to 12 minutes about the side effects with all the disclaimers. So I know I'm not a fan of this type of advertising. I know it's a free country and they can do what they want. And I understand the disclaimers and they need to have the disclaimers. But for me, I see kind of the same type of behavior. They're controlling the airwaves through media, through commercials, through paid advertising. I get that. But it just seems to be a deluge of new drugs with lots of side effects that may not be so good for you. Any thoughts on that?
Well, the difference between today and the 1800s is today we know the things we're putting in our system. If you go back to the 1890s and the 1900s and at the heyday of the patent medicine men, they were selling cocaine, morphine, and alcohol. There wasn't a lot of laws governing what they could and couldn't sell. But people didn't know what was in the nostrums that they were taking. And as a result of that, the public was buying these things because it didn't require bleeding or cathartics or some painful or violently destructive poison that the allopathic physicians were giving them to take. So in the early 1800s, everything in the 1800s and 1900s cured everything. They used ads and planted articles in the newspapers to sell all of it. The patent medicine kings, as I said, owned and controlled over 80% of the newspapers in the United States. But if you look at the advertising today, the most interesting thing is nothing cures anything without significant side effects and serious limitations. And every ad of a new drug is has some made-up brand name, and it puts all this together in this nice little package that at the end, the potential side effects after you listen to them are worse than the affliction that they're there to treat. And they conclude with a bright, airy scene of some happy person, supposedly as a result of taking this concoction, and a closing line that basically says, ask your doctor, blah, blah, blah. The problem with today's chemistries, number one, is that we have run through most of the low-hanging fruit about 20 years ago. They've been synthesizing using computers drugs now for 60 years, 50 years. And they've had simulations that could simulate the effects of drugs in the body and look at interactions. And a number of years ago, they realized they were running out of things that were low-hanging fruit. 20 years ago, it was true that the new drugs that were coming, this is around shortly after Lipitor hit the market, the new drugs hitting the marketplace would never have an easy path to get into the market. They were going to have more side effects and more dangerous things that could happen to you. The one thing you should understand about it is what the drug companies don't tell you in their advertising today is they say, go ask your doctor. But in reality, you shouldn't be asking your doctor. you should be asking a pharmacist, the guy that actually knows how the chemical works and how it's been compounded. They're the ones that really understand, and you should always talk to your pharmacist when you're getting a new drug. Find out what the risks are, and don't just ask the risks. Ask what are the likely risks, because they'll tell you all these risks and act like they're all very low level, and that's not always the case. And the second thing is, sometimes there might be another drug that's similar to the drug your doctor has prescribed, that may be older or newer, that may, from the pharmacist's perspective, work better in you, either because he knows the other drugs you're taking, or he may know enough about you now and your lifestyle to know these drugs might work better because of what you do in your daily life. So my advice to anybody going out that's just gotten a new prescription is ask your pharmacist, the real drug specialist, what their opinion of that drug is. And if the pharmacist doesn't think it's as good for you as something else, you should feel free to call your physician and say, Doc, I know you prescribed this, but what about that? In the end, these things, many of these drugs have significant side effects. Yeah, go ahead.
No, that's correct. And I will argue that we know what's in them. And it's publications, they have to make the disclaimers, but there's no disclaimers about what happens if they mix them with the wrong drugs. And there's these, they had to adjust my mother-in-law's medication yesterday because what they prescribed to her was having a reverse effect. So you have to constantly keep on top of this stuff.
And some people get medications from multiple pharmacies. They stop here, they stop there. They're not even the same chain. And as a result of that, when a pharmacist is making a prescription with a new drug, he's supposed to look at your prescription history and run it through a drug interaction database. And they look at this database and they compare what you're taking with the other drugs that they know you're taking. And they look for negative interactions. And if they find one, then they will try and get a hold of the doctor and change your prescription. But if you're getting your medicine from a variety of different places, and then they don't have the ability, there's no national place for one pharmacy to see everything you're doing, because we do not coordinate today all the care that we receive. That includes the pharmaceuticals that we're taking. So these are some of the historical problems that were created in the section we're just getting ready to talk about that now are preying on us today. Our national non-system of healthcare is composed, as we said before, of a lot of parts that were there to fix the problems of these individuals like we just described, who are trying to keep their businesses alive, but not a long-term effect of what's going to happen in 10 or 20 or 30 years.
Exactly, which brings up one point I want to make, just so people understand the effect this has on the economics of healthcare. So in 2007, Senator Charles Grassley, Republican of Iowa, and Senator Herb Kohl, Democrat from Wisconsin, introduced a thing called the Sunshine Act. And what it was doing was a report on what doctors were being paid for consulting, for podium speeches, for research, for showing up, for a number of things. And what it was supposed to do was expose these egregious behaviors that were going on. And believe me, I lived those days, and they were egregious. And I think it's had some effect. Because now there's a national database that has to be reported to. It's clearly shut down all the whining and dining by the pharmaceutical and the medical, at least for the medical device side, I can tell you that.
Or at least most of it.
Most of it. Yeah, it still goes on, but not to the degree it used to. It was very egregious and accepted practice back in the day. Well, back when I was in the heyday of the medical imaging business. But that's been curtailed somewhat. But there's workarounds, and there's bad behavior, and there's bad characters out there. But I just want to make one point. This Sunshine Act was enacted. It's had a pendulum swing to it. You can't buy a doctor a bagel, all the way to trade shows are very well restricted. But at the same time, the practice can still continue as long as it's reported and exposed. So it's the open reporting process. So I just want to make a couple of points. In 2016, in the United States, physicians were paid and this is on the reported payments, not the non-reported payments. Well, I will say it's at least 30, 40%, there that's not reported. $8.2 billion were paid to physicians by medical device and pharmaceutical companies. If you look at the beginning of the Sunshine Act, which was 2013 or 14, I can't remember when they first started recording it, but in that period up until today, and this is only 2016 data because 2017 hasn't been published, $25 billion have been paid to physicians by medical device and pharmaceutical companies for consulting, podium speeches, whatever they need them to do. Now, some of it's legit, and some of it we need because we need that expertise. But I just want to make sure people understand there's another source of income for physicians out there. Not all of them do it, not very few actually do it, but the ones that really do it, they really take advantage of it.
And the other thing is you have to understand that there's two kinds of ways to pay for influence. One is I pay you and I tell you specifically what I want you to say and you go parrot it. Another is I wine and dine you, or I have you come speak at my conferences because you've shown an affection for my drug, and I'm having you come in. Number one, I'm reinforcing you to support the products I have because now you're getting hotel rooms paid for, speaking fees, research fees, other expenses covered. But you're also now influencing your brethren on using my drug. So I'm not talking to them directly. You are. And I'm not 100% sure of this. You may be. But part of my expenses at this show may be to host a meeting or host a seminar or host a dinner party that is talking in some way about what I do in my practice. And I believe that these companies are eligible to help offset some of my expenses for these shows. So it may not be as out as it was before, but these kind of influences still work behind the scenes. And it is ridiculous to think that they're never going to happen and somehow or another we're going to stop this kind of behavior. It is part of humankind. It will be this way as long as we are on this planet.
Agreed. And again, most 99.9% follow the rules. But as usual, a few ruin it for everybody else. So let's move on to getting started with the next history lesson here. So in 1815 to 1899, that's where we ended up. Now, physicians, they sought safety in numbers. In the middle of the 19th century, the medical profession faced a crisis. The rise of patent medicines, which we talked about, the expanded role of hospitals, particularly in treating the wealthy, which we'll talk about, and the popularity of homeopathic and electric treatments, and the general effectiveness of allopathic bleeding and purging treatments all work together to erode the prestige of the physician profession. So remember back then, doctors and physicians were different. So you want to lead us into this next session, just a quick overview of that again to make people understand why they were different, and more or less we'll talk later about how they came together.
Sure. Well, going back again to the 1800s, doctors worked in hospitals and physicians, private physicians, worked in people's private homes. People that had means, had money, would literally not be caught dead in a hospital. But painless surgery and antiseptic practice changed the landscape for physicians drastically, negatively, and drastically improved the lot of doctors and hospitals, because that became the place that antiseptic practice and painless surgery with ether could be performed in a safe way. And even then, they had accidents in the operating theaters of a few hospitals. Adding to this was the damage done to the practice of the private physician by druggists and the newer schools of medicine. The new schools were being viewed as more effective and at least less painful and risky than the old style personal private physician who practiced allopathic medicine. So the death knell at this time was ringing for private allopathic physicians. One physician reported in New York's Medical Society Journal in that period in the 1890s that there is a handsome income for a few, a competence for many, and a pittance for the majority. And in reality, if you look at the economics of being a private physician back in those days, going into people's homes, you were really losing patients and losing your income.
Yeah, I mean, going to people's homes, is that where the term house call came from?
It did. It didn't come in that period of time. It actually came a bit later. It's attributed now to between the 1940s and 50s, because even though hospitals happened and private physicians and doctors started to merge together by 1912, 1915, the actual practice of care still happened a lot in people's homes. Some people went to hospital, some people were seen in the home, but physicians typically still didn't have a home office or a business office. But in the 1940s and 50s, the practice of medicine started to change more to office-based delivery of care, and the term house call was derived at that time, likely just to distinguish on a calendar between whether the physician was going to be in the office and seeing multiple people or out seeing Mary down the street, which was going to be one person over a 20 or 30 or 40 minute trip or maybe longer. So as time changed, it was around the 1940s, 1950s as the term house call really started to come into being.
So let's thank you for that clarification, because I remember the physician actually coming to our house when my father was sick many years ago.
It was cheaper under indemnity insurance to have them come to your house than to go to the office.
Yeah, can't see very many patients that way, so it won't work today.
Right.
So let's step back. The physicians were under pressure, and like any group under pressure, they're going to figure out a way to solve this problem. So enter the AMA. In 1847, the American Medical Association was formed by Dr. Nathan Davis. The goal, to defend and promote the endangered practice of allopathic medicine. Interesting. The AMA had three-pronged strategies: assume control of the granting of licenses in order to regulate the number of physicians in practice, open private physicians-owned board and care homes to compete with hospitals for upscale patrons, which we're going to expand upon, wage a national campaign to convince the public that only AMA-certified medical science could bring real cure and relief to illness, injury, and disease. I think they did a pretty good job of that, Tom. What do you think?
Yeah, they did. They made tremendous inroads in getting us there. And when you really drill back into it, you're going, wow, it's amazing what they accomplished, considering they started out in a very small way. The AMA is actually version 2 of what Dr. Nathan Davis started with the New York Medical Society. In fact, that quote from their journal was the society that Nathan Davis, Dr. Davis, formed in New York because New York physicians were going out of business. So he had had success in getting New York to gain control in New York under licensure and improving the business prospects of allopathic physicians. So then in 1847, the AMA was founded to defend and promote the endangered practice of allopathic medicine. The stated purpose of this new organization was to elevate the standard of medical education in the United States, i.e., you had to be an allopathic physician or you weren't good enough to practice medicine. And they were very, very good at going out and making that happen. And oddly enough, the standard that they propagated didn't include any other schools of medicine, certainly not hospital-trained doctors. And the AMA did a couple other things. They implemented regional physician associations around the United States. That became the hub in each state where the physicians went after the state government and lobbied for the change in licensure. And they also started to establish board and care homes to offset the growing value of hospitals. They rapidly opened these board and care homes, and remember, the elite public, the buying public, didn't want to go to a hospital, really. They were going there because they were getting something they couldn't get elsewhere. So the AMA helped form these board and care homes, which in later episodes we might talk about the formation of insurance and HMOs. Most of that started in these regional associations and board and care homes as it grew. But hospitals they wanted to get control of the hospitals, and they wanted to grab out of the hospitals what they called extraordinary patients, and they wanted to leave in the hospital what they called ordinary patients.
So Tom, why did they want to leave the ordinary patients in the hospital?
Well, that's interesting because we think of ordinary and extraordinary today as having kind of different meanings, but the actual word extraordinary in the 1800s was used to describe the patients that went to hospitals who had some means to pay for services. Most of the patients they saw in the 1800s were ordinary patients. Hospitals, as I said, were not places for people that could afford to pay. Almost all patients, except mental patients in the hospitals, were ordinary patients. And that left the non-paying patients in the hands initially of the private physician, but as the extraordinary patient, the one that could afford to pay, started to go to the hospitals, the physician set up the board and care homes to draw them back over, so the hospital was still left with the people that couldn't afford to pay for anything. So it was a way to economically attack hospitals as well as keep their foothold in control of the marketplace. And you know what? It worked.
It worked, and it still works.
Yep.
And we'll get into that in a later example, but I will tell you today, it's done under a different set of pretenses and under a different set of umbrellas, but clearly it's an advantage, especially with some of these orthopedic surgeons, to push the patients that are extraordinary into their ambulatory surgical centers that they're typically financially engaged with, and leave the lower paying procedures to the hospital. It happens every day. There's challenges about this, there's lawsuits about this, the list goes on and on. But it does occur, and it's not the same as this particular example of why they did it back then, but I'll argue it's typically the same behavior. And
it's the same. It's the same outcome. And the other point, which we'll talk about when we get into how we can change our system, is that we need to start to recognize that we don't have a medical system. We don't have one medical system. We have a need for two. We have a need for a system that is going to deliver the things that people need to stay alive and stay productive, and we have the needs for another system that delivers the things they want that they're willing to pay a little bit more for. And we need to integrate both of those systems together so that we don't end up with cost shifting between the two, and we can actually get control over care and benefits in a holistic way. But this is an example, this is one of the historic examples of many that we're covering as to why we need to move in this direction and why the government has not been able to fix it.
Let's get on to the fun stuff, and that's new medicine selling the cures.
Right.
In 1857, there were about 1,500 patent medicines listed for sale in New York. By 1900, there were an estimated 28,000. They all had one thing in common: little medical value, and they were addictive and sold at high margins. You want to kind of go over that and help us understand a little bit more about what that means?
Well, yeah, and this truly was the fun stuff, because these things, as we've said before, were cocaine, morphine, and alcohol. And a lot of times they were combinations of all three. So most of the cures that were out there in the patent medicine world were dangerous and highly addictive. And I'll give you a list of just a couple of the common ones from the 1800s. One was Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. It was composed mostly of morphine. Hall's Catarrh Cure. Hall's Catarrh Cure was mostly cocaine. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound for women was mostly cocaine and a little alcohol. Perunia, which was one of the top sellers for quite a while, was like laudanum, another one, was morphine and alcohol, or cocaine and alcohol and morphine at the same time. Perunia went through 3 or 4 different iterations. There was Bernie's Catarrhal Cure, which again was a treatment for disease, and it was another cocaine-based powder. And the diseases that they were treating in those days had names that none of us would recognize today, and I just used a few of them. Catarrh is one, and catarrh is a buildup of mucus in an airway or cavity of the body but it's really nothing more than congestion, and its treatment had to do with how to get rid of one of the four humors, get one of the four humors back in balance, mucus being one of the four humors. There was lots of bilious solutions, bilious pills, bilious drops, bilious powder. And what bilious fever was an 1800 medical diagnosis often used for anything that had a fever or exhibited symptoms of nausea or vomiting, in addition to increase in internal body temperature. Bilious really meant that it had something to do with bile, which again was one of the four types of humors of the traditional Galenic medicine of 300 AD, which is, again, some of that Galenic medicine is still built into the practice of medicine today, believe it or not. You had another disease that they treated was women's monthlies. And of course, women's monthlies were menstrual cramps. You had nervous prostrations. I remember my dad telling me as a kid he thought I was having nervous prostrations, and I thought he was joking. I didn't realize it actually when he was a kid was a real diagnosis. He was born in 1909. And it was an interesting diagnosis because in the 1800s, it meant you were uniquely American. It was believed to most that it commonly affected lawyers and physicians and inventors, people that worked with their head. What we would think of it now as just basically stress-related. But the findings included a loss of interest in mental labor and heart disturbances, and later it was called neurasthenia. And we talked about Nervine in a prior episode that became Alka-Seltzer, and that was a treatment for neurasthenia, which became a big issue. There were all kinds of cures for neurasthenia through the 20s and the 30s. But this was the core of the patent medicines of that day.
Well, that's interesting. Now I know what's wrong with you. So,
I have neurasthenia.
It's an incredible story, but it goes on and on. So what happened to these patent medicines?
Well, some of them were driven out of business pretty quickly, obviously, and many hung on for a long time afterwards, and some actually still exist today, most of them in the form of a typical consumer product, although we had some up until our youth that were still around as medicines. Here's some examples of things that exist today that were patent medicines in their day. Pond's cold cream, that was a patent medicine. It cured cancer, it cured all kinds of things. Horehound drops, which some people may have seen. I grew up with them. They were a patent medicine. Again, it wasn't just a cough drop. It cured a lot of other things, catarrh being one. Smith Brothers cough drops, which still exist today, you can find in some stores as a candy more than anything else. They were originally Smith Brothers catarrh cure, and they had little to no medicinal value at all. There was Bibbs acidulated soda. We now call that 7-Up. There was Dr. Heyer's root beer. That's obviously root beer. We have Heyer's root beer. We have Jamaican ginger beer, which is now called Canada Dry Ginger Ale. We had Dr. Pepper. We had Coca-Cola. All of these started as patent medicines. And as you can see from what we call sodas today, most of them came from medicines delivered to patients in a form of carbolic acid solution, what we call soda. As the temperance movement began to rise in the 1890s, alcohol was getting banned in towns and counties. Druggists had to replace the alcohol with something that would keep cocaine and morphine and all these other things in solution. So they turned to acidulated water, soda water, carbolic acid. So druggists had to replace the alcohol with carbolic acid, and a simple solution used was soda water. So by the late 1800s, almost all druggists had a soda machine, what we now call a soda fountain, used to deliver the medicine that was made in the form of a thick syrup into a cup and then mix it with soda water so the patient could go drink the concoction. Hard drinks in those days were the medicines that were delivered in an alcohol base, and soft drinks were those that were delivered using soda water. But by the 1920s, the patent medicine era was dying, and many of the cure-alls were now just delicious refreshments. The pharmacy soda fountain moved from behind the drug counter all the way to the front or the back in a more prominent location, and now they sold soft drinks, Coke, Pepsi, all these things, ice creams, and food. So that's kind of how we got to where we are today and where those guys went, for the most part.
Well, I sure remember the pharmacy soda fountain when I was a kid. My mom used to take me in there. It was kind of a treat, actually. It's right downtown in Urbana, Illinois. Don't blame that on me. I know that some of those are still with us today, like Pond's Cold Cream. Who would suspect? I think in the book you told a story about Dr. Miles Laboratories, and we mentioned that in a last episode, I think. I know he had Nervine and later Alka-Seltzer, but that was not their first product, correct?
No. In fact, Dr. Miles' first product, I would guarantee you that you and everybody listening today has had in their life at least once. I would venture to say that 80 to 90% of the population have a bottle of it in their refrigerator, and any place you go that serves hamburgers or snack foods or diners, they likely have a bottle of it on your table. It was originally introduced as Dr. Miles Compound Extract of Tomato. It cured just about everything, and you and I call it ketchup.
I don't eat that very much, but I had some last night with my French fries. I don't think it cured anything, but I think it just got me fatter, to be honest with you.
Probably.
It's an interesting how these things develop. So let's wrap it up here. It's been an interesting journey, this session. I hope people have enjoyed it. Let me talk a little bit about our next show. We're moving out and moving into the 20th century. Next show is going to take us from the mess of the late 1900s and explain how the situation finally started to change. And this is, I was born in 1952, so this is going to be really interesting. We will talk about how in our history it is women that have forced the necessary changes, and how another segment we will see how our current quagmire formed during the rise of the progressive era. I want to overstress this one more time. It was the women that forced necessary changes. So I think we'll have a great segment on that going forward. I know you had a couple of ideas for the next show as an opportunity to throw something else in there before episode 1.4. So I'd like to give your final thoughts and thoughts on what we need to do going forward, and what you thought about today, and general thoughts around this whole topic.
Well, in general, I want to basically say I think we're about halfway through the history we needed to get to. I know that these shows are running a little longer than what we'd like them to. They're typically running 55 minutes to an hour. But we didn't want to end up having to take 10 shows to kind of get all the background information to get to where we all have a basic common idea of how we got here, so we can now start to talk about what's wrong and how to change it. So we appreciate all of you guys sitting and listening to these shows. We know they're long. Listen to them in spurts if you need to. We're figuring this out as we go, and we're learning a little bit about it. So put up with it. We're trying to get better as we go. We thank you for coming and listening to the show. We really do appreciate your attendance. Please make sure that you press the like button and subscribe so that we can get you down. It's very important that we can get those subscribes in. It really helps us a great deal. We're located now also on iTunes, Google Play Music, YouTube, Spotify. We're on Stitcher. We're on TuneIn Radio. We obviously have our video channel on YouTube. You're probably watching the video right now. If you're not, we encourage you, when you get a chance, watch the video, even though the audio is just fine. The video has a lot of other information that come up in the forms of slide and charts and graphics. And finally, again, just remember to subscribe so that you get notice to our next show. Both Tim and I appreciate your coming and listening to what we're saying, and we really do thank you for joining us on this journey. So it's been great having you with us, and it's been great working with you again, Tim. I hope you've had a good time, and I'd say goodbye.
Thanks, Tom. Had a great time, and thanks everyone for listening. See you next time.